In 1993, it was a great time to play games. On the console side, titles like Aladdin, Mega Man X, and even Kirby's Adventure were released as instant classics. On the handheld side of things, the Game Boy was still doing well with the launch of The Legend of Zelda. Even the Game Gear was doing alright, with Sonic titles like Chaos and Portable Puyo Mean Bean Machine. But what seemed prominent in '93 was that 3D games were proving that they were finally ready to be popular at home. Of course, there had been 3D games before this year, but this was the year where 3D games were not compromising gameplay in order to be valid. Games such as Doom, Myst, and most impressively for console, Star Fox. Although Sega had nothing at the time to really compete with 3D that year, that didn't mean they were without a plan. '93 had been an excellent year in the arcades with Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA. Of course, in the early 90s, they had their sights set not to be outdone by their competitor. In 1994, engines would rev, turns would be drifted, and both Sega and Nintendo would pump their own versions of performance-enhancing drugs into their console for a glimpse of the future. When it comes to consoles peddling the feasibility of their tech, racing games are usually a great choice. Since almost the beginning of video games, the racing game genre has always been a way to show what a benchmark the hardware is capable of. Even with the launch of the PS5 and Xbox Series X, a new Gran Turismo or Forza Motorsport is certainly soon to follow. But where more modern hardware is interested in how nicely the car runs in a shiny resolution, performance is not always a given with older titles. As would be seen with Atari Jaguar's game Checkered Flag, consistent frame rate was a large part of the battle. And this is where Nintendo and Sega come in, and where two very different approaches to do 3D racing on console emerged. Coming high off the crowning achievement of Star Fox from the year before, Nintendo had worked with a team at Argonaut Software to make not just a technical marvel, but also an IP filled with personality. Each level of Star Fox boasted cinematic space opera-esque moments, filled with an enjoyable group of companions and sound effects to go along with it. I mention all these things first because it's what's so memorable about the game. What we also cannot shy away from is that even with the power-enhancing Super FX chip, the frame rate of the game can change very drastically when more action comes on the screen. It creates for a choppy experience, but so much of that can be forgotten, all due to the complementary elements. For Stunt Race FX, the development team understood the strengths and weaknesses of what they had. The Super FX chip was good, but it was not something built for high-speed racing. A different approach would need to be implemented. The result is a slower game, but with more inviting appeal. For this reason, Stunt Race FX feels much more like a Mario Kart style game than that of an F-Zero, on the surface level at least. Just like Mario Kart, however, Stunt Race does not betray the tense action that makes racing games so enjoyable. Where the game lacks in its speed, there's still plenty of moments where the bounciness of your car makes for handling hijinks, or where large turns have your car skirting around in a place where control can take a lot of mastery. To keep the action going as well, certain levels have even dynamic moments like boulders falling from a cliff onto a track to add more chaos. Stunt Race also doesn't sacrifice for variety either to make the replayability even more enjoyable. You have 4 different vehicles to choose from, excluding the truck from the bonus stage, each with different handling and weight. And on top of this, you have even more variation of modes and levels than that of even Super Mario Kart. Sporting 20 unique levels spread across multiple game modes, with these tracks we see a lot of things like cityscapes, foggy valleys, and even one that takes place in an underwater glass pipe. The gameplay, while limited by the tech, is made in a way that sidesteps a lot of the issues that the game could have faced, and the result is the equivalent of racing in a bouncy castle. The difficulty can get quite challenging, but that's perfectly fine as the game's controls feel so satisfying to drive with. You don't mind putting in the time to perfecting it all while bashing into walls and other cars. Even as you do, its variation in car options can help serve for playing in a way that best accommodates your playstyle, or even just freshening up things. Under the hood, however, we can see that Nintendo had always been taking notes, and while at first Stunt Race feels a bit ditzy and carefree in a Mario way, it very much has the same tension and risk-taking that makes F-Zero so endearing. Whereas the atmosphere is borrowed from the portly plumber, the mechanics of conserving speed boosts and damage adds to the strategy and approach of each track. Managing when to use precious boosts can have an experimental risk and reward while controlling the car, while taking damage, on the other hand, can dictate how aggressive one can be with collisions to the opposing 3 racers in speed tracks. On top of all of this is the life system that can make the risk of not even finishing the circuit if a wrong turn is made on some unfortunate slopes. Like an arcade racer, Stunt Race FX has a time system and checkpoints that the race needs to be finished in. However, Stunt Race uses this in each circuit to add or subtract time off the next course. If you finished your last race with a pittance of seconds remaining, the following race will prove much more difficult. It's a great solution for incentivizing mastery of each stage while always striving for better improvement, and making it more than just intrinsic motivation to get better. The interesting mesh of inspirations that Stunt Race originates itself from creates a peculiar bridge in difficulty from Nintendo's racers. Sure, a few bad turns will not make absolute doom on the race, but the game will become much more strict on the second and third difficulty courses. It took a lot of time and effort to actually make it to the hardest difficulty tracks of the game, and it strikes me as one where most players won't see some of the courses without a lot of dedicated time and effort. The challenge of the game is a bit odd considering how playful the game presents itself. Every car has a personified attitude painted on the menus and screens thanks to expressive eyes around each car. The soundtrack by Shinobu Miyake keeps things carefree yet determined, complementing the rubbery feeling of your car. Even the box art for the game comes in a more claymation style, giving the game a more toyish joy to the whole experience. The game succeeds even more so in hiding the shortcomings than Star Fox had done before it in order to display less. The resolution of the actual screen is quite small, but it's bordered in a very appealing way, and that keeps the UI tidy and easy to understand. This makes the game almost instantly understandable in what to keep an eye on while not considering the screen space lost. Compare this even to Super Mario Kart, which took up half its screen to show the map, and you can see that the real estate is put to good use. Even in the second player game mode, the UI is shifted around to accommodate for the 2 players, and while it's a bit crunched in terms of seeing things coming, the slower nature of the game makes it to be less of a hindrance. In the multiplayer as well, for better and worse, the tracks are a little bit less complicated, but that might be also to keep things readable with a smaller screen, where I can only imagine the more complex bumps and divots of other levels could be lost in parsing the terrain. Stunt Race borrows a lot of bells and whistles from its foundational forefathers, while also playfully sporting its own little homages to R-Wings and the Red Plumber himself. The game does not have as much recognition when discussed in retro circles, despite selling well over 1 million units. In the transition to 3D, it's easy to look back at the primitive first attempts and footnote them as growing pains in the genre. But Nintendo made darn sure that behind the tech, there would be all the fixings and memorable moments of any other quality game on the console. Looking at Sega's approach now, we see that their entry into 3D console games comes from their arcade roots, both for better and for worse. In 1992, Sega would show off their technically impressive and rich playing game Virtua Racer. I say rich because it cost $1 to play, but also it played and looked like no other game at the time, able to hook up multiplayer with 8 other cabinets, and it sold in 3 different configurations. It played at an absolutely stunning and consistent 30 frames per second. This wasn't just 3D. This was a crowning achievement for technology of the time. And this was no fluke either, as it was developed by the team AM2, who had been responsible for creating some of the best superscalar games, and more specifically, landmarks like Super Hang-On and Outrun. This was only a note in Sega's incredible history of making top-tier racers. Chances are, if you come upon an arcade in modern days, the inevitable racing offering is of the Sega brand. While modern racers enjoy catering a bit more to the car enthusiasts out there, Sega was and still is fantastic at creating pick-up-and-play racers with really easy to learn and hard to master satisfaction. In terms of having a grand appeal, Virtual Racing was perhaps a harder sell in North America. F1 racing has only recently gained more popularity, and for that reason, North Americans will likely look at Virtua's younger brother, Daytona USA, when they think of Sega 3D racing. This wasn't to say that there was no interest at the time, but it certainly seemed to have an uphill battle than the appeal of a bouncy and bumpy race car variety. However, there's something to be said about seeing a racing game in action, especially when its speed and visuals look phenomenal. That's at least something to get one's eye on an arcade cabinet, and Sega proved this with the same success it found with Super Monaco GP in years prior, overcoming the odds and being able to be at the top of the charts in 1992 and 1993. No, the real challenge came from a technically impressive and rich playing game on home console. And I say rich because it was priced at $100, and adjusted for inflation is more like $200 today. This was a problem. So much of a problem that I can only find a few stark examples of actual marketing for the game in catalogs for that year on Sega Genesis and Megadrive. While there are commercials in Europe, the attitude for this game was to more show off how impressive the game was, and please don't bother looking at the price until you reach the till. The main reasons for the price hike was the response to the Nintendo's Super FX chip, the SVP. While far superior to the SNES FX chip, rendering 9,000 polygons on screen, its superiority came with quite the price. Gamers at the time were quite wary of these rising prices for 3D graphics when it came to Nintendo's FX games. Virtual Racing was trying to push the bar even higher, and in that way, this meant that it had to prove itself more than games like Stunt Race or Star Fox. So for those in 1994 who picked it up, what's there to be seen? Well, despite taking a hit in the polygon department, resolution, and running at a slower frame rate, it's the full conversion of the arcade original from the gameplay perspective. All 3 tracks are accounted for, along with the additional difficulty doshed out by the cabinet counterpart. You as the racer must make your way from the back to the front runners in the span of 5 laps. Despite being what I consider quite good at the game, I was only able to place first in the first track, known as the bridge, and second in track number 2, known as the Acropolis. As for the third and final track, let's just say you're lucky to make it to all the laps in the given time that you have. This difficulty can come from a few places, the first being that this game retains its dollar-munching difficulty when one poor lap can mean placing poorly, even if no collisions are made. Speaking of collisions, a novel touch to the game is the ability to take damage and get some help from your low polygonal crew. It's a nice little touch, but it's not really needed for anything other than the third racetrack. Although placements are important, the game also of course records the best times in classic arcade fashion. One issue here is that the game does not come with any battery save, so times are only recorded during one play session. Although quite a bit of Sega library does not have records like this, it comes off a little absurd when considering this a luxury product for the time. Yes, not many racing games had this feature, but its omittance is noticed, especially after its inclusion in the Sega-published Ayrton Senna's Super Monaco GP2 in 1992. It may sound like a rather short game with 3 tracks, but it certainly does not feel that way with how much practice will need to be logged. A common complaint cited is that due to its low resolution, it can be hard to parse the track ahead. While I agree to an extent with that regarding opposing racers, in some ways the memorization of the track comes with almost every speedy racer of this vintage, to the point where the expectation of how to make a turn is already pre-planned on the previous bend. Touching on the sound as well, the game impressively finds a great mix between highlighting the sounds of the cars with music by Takanobu Mitsuyoshi, highlighting each checkpoint reached with an encouraging and motivational jingle. Virtual Racing for the Genesis and Megadrive is exactly what it says on the tin. Much like the early titles for the 16-bit console, it's very much like the arcade, with a number of asterisks and compromises, making them not as perfect as one may like, but perfectly valid. The problem both now and in 1994 is that there's more asterisks to add. It's very hard to look at the 16-bit version in a vacuum when only 8 months later would be the launch of the Sega 32X, and with it, Virtua Racing Deluxe. Running on the 32X, the game runs smoother and has a higher resolution. But where it really becomes a harder pill to swallow is that the game includes 2 more tracks and 2 extra cars, and some incredible additions to music by Naofumi Hataya. Whereas Virtua Racing had a 16 meg cartridge, the 32X sported a 24 meg cart, meaning the Genesis probably could have had 40% more of the game. It really appeared as if Sega was quick to release a standard version of Virtua Racing as a proof of concept, but then as the 32X was released, AM2 was given more time to tune it up. Within less than a year, Virtua Racing outdated itself, and its appeal to consumers was lost when a shinier and less expensive version was also out the same holiday season. Ironically enough, even this version would be contested when the Sega Saturn version launched a year later. And in having to bring all this up, therein lies the problem with Virtua Racing on console. Its own subsequent reissuing detracted from its own greatness in a way that undermined the costliness of the hardware attached to it. Comparing the Nintendo and Sega approach when it comes to these two games really encompasses both companies' approaches to the end of the console war. It seemed like Nintendo took its time to really add as much value as they could to Stunt Race FX, while working and improving upon the limitations they had with Star Fox. Sega, with a perhaps unhealthy obsession with being cutting edge, released a fast-paced arcade port that at the time was excellent, but was then abruptly overshadowed by that company wanting to move along to newer and bigger hardware. Virtua Racing for the Sega Genesis and Megadrive plays really well, but was always a direct translation from the original, with nothing new brought to the table. For those interested in their VR fix, in 2019, developer M2 made a Switch version that runs and looks even better than the arcade version. This sadly makes Virtua Racing for the Genesis nothing more than an interesting curiosity. On the other hand, while a bit slow at points, Stunt Race FX is still a tightly knit package. Despite losing a lot of its novelty as a 3D racer, is even more enjoyable to play now thanks to the standardization of larger TVs for bigger view of play. In its day, it was generally reviewed well and heralded as one of the best racers of the time. But of the time does not always stand the test of time, and so while it may be forgotten nowadays, it's a fantastic treasure to rediscover as long as expectations are understood. Both games are affordable and moderately accessible through legal means of procurement, and the multiplayer for both can still be fun with friends who are interested. At the end of the day, these games still play great on their hardware, and showcasing the power of each console, while also being so much more than just technical landmarks. Hey, thanks for watching my video. If you like what you see, make sure to hit subscribe so you can see when new uploads are released.